The evolution of transportation from personal mobility to freight is at the center of economic development and a major driver of modern economic activity. It is also closely linked to productivity-enhancing technological change. Horsepower gave way to steam power, which was then replaced by internal combustion. The ubiquitous expansion of the internal combustion engine for over a century has been a major driver of the development of petroleum-based transportation fuels. In recent years, environmental concerns have motivated a re-examination of fuel use, and hence the role of the internal combustion engine. Now, every mode of transportation is considering alternatives to traditional petroleum fuels, but there are many questions to be answered. Questions such as, which fuel is best for each mode? How much of each new fuel will be available? What is the full cycle cost of different energy options for transportation? What are the supply chain issues associated with each energy option? The Baker Institute Center for Energy Studies is launching an initiative to examine the future of fuels, which is aimed at answering these and other questions to elevate discourse around transportation policy. With us to discuss the future of transportation is Ed Emmett, Fellow in Transportation Policy. I'm Ken Medlock, Senior Director of the Center for Energy Studies, and James A. Baker III and Susan G. Baker, Fellow in Energy and Natural Resources at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas. And this is Baker Briefing. Welcome, Ed.
Good to be here. This is a fun topic.
Absolutely. So I'll just jump right in. How much public discussion is focused on petroleum-based fuels versus, say, electricity? And is the future more complicated than a choice between those two energy options?
It's much more complicated. And in fact, the public generally only sees it in terms of petroleum-based fuel and energy. It's a binary choice in their mind. But already, we were talking about moving freight. The various modes of transportation are already looking at many, many, many alternatives. And there's a realization that while, as you mentioned, what's the future of the internal combustion engine, those aren't going away just immediately. So what's the transition going to be like? What are going to be some of the drop-in fuels that may be able to be used in internal combustion engines going forward? Will we completely do away with petroleum products? Probably not. I mean, there are some modes that won't. But, for example, already if you just think about the fuels that are either in use or experimentally in use, you've got compressed natural gas, liquefied natural gas, renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, all forms of hydrogen, methanol, ethanol, ammonia. How do you coordinate all that? And who's going to make those decisions? And what really got us into this, and I'll give shorter answers in the future, but what got us into this was the question of renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel, both made from used cooking oils and grease and animal fats. And we started asking the question, how much of that is there? And if every airline suddenly starts using it and every trucker is there enough to go around? Of course, the answer is no. And so then you have to start talking about priorities. So if you can only make so much of it, do the airlines get it? Do the truckers get it? A lot of questions.
So you just sort of stepped into a really critical question with regard to the future of fuels, and that is one around supply chains. When you think about the supply chains and you think about the availability of different supplies of different types of fuels, you mentioned renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, but even getting so far as to think about electrification and batteries, and I'll connect that to freight because specifically I want to ask a question that I know it's something you've been addressing in public discourse, but how would we see a major transition, particularly in freight and heavy trucking, occur? Because it's not just about the availability of fuels, is it? It's about the aptitude or the appetite, I should say, for buying new rigs, buying new equipment.
Sure. I mean, a huge percentage of the long-haul truckers are what are known as independent owner-operators. They own their own trucks, and their entire life savings are tied up in those rigs. If some state, for example, California, says all trucks have to be electric, they'll move. They'll go somewhere else because they can't afford to just go out and buy a whole new electric truck. So that's where some of these drop-in fuels become much more interesting to look at. But I think every freight mode is now looking at what's their best alternative, knowing that there are going to be government policies that say you've got to reduce emissions, you've got to reduce the carbon footprint, and each mode's going to be different. And I always get back to nobody knows how it's going to turn out. And I'm of such an age, I remember when we had beta and VHS tapes. And Sony decided beta was the best tape in terms of performance. So VHS was let go. Well, how many people use beta versus VHS? It didn't work. Turned out VHS was the winner. We were going to be the winners in this whole process. And the supply chain is critical, because then you start talking about where are these fuels of the future, or as you mentioned, the battery components, going to be sourced. And then how do you get them to where they're going to be used ultimately? This is a fascinating conversation to have.
Absolutely. It's funny. You just leaned into prediction is hard, especially when it's about the future, right? So I'll tilt the conversation a little bit into really something that you've kind of highlighted, which is every mode of transportation is different. So when you think about freight movement on land versus rail versus sea versus air, all the way down to passenger transportation, I wonder if you could lean into a little bit how each one of those might actually evolve differently. Of course, I'm not putting you on the spot to make a prediction, but just thinking about some of the issues you just laid out, how does that connect?
Well, there are some basics. And let's talk about the United States, because the U.S. rail system is different than the rail system in Europe, for example. That one's pretty much electrified. But the U.S. rail system, where we really only have 5 or 6 major railroads in North America, they can do whatever they want because they own the tracks, own the equipment, and own the fueling stations. So if they decide to go to a particular fuel that's different from what they're using now, it's easy for them. They have to get it there. That's where the supply chain comes in. But they control their own destiny. Ocean ships. If you have a ship that's fueled by ammonia, that means you can only go to ports that are going to have ammonia to refuel your ship. Truckers, what are the truck stops going to carry? I don't want to pour cold water on one idea, but there's quite a few people are talking about liquid hydrogen as a truck fuel long haul. Well, you got to talk to the truck stops. Are they going to put in the cryogenic tanks? What do you have to maintain, minus 260 degrees or something for liquid hydrogen? Are the truck stops going to be willing to do that? Or can they afford to do that? And so trucks are going to be different than ocean. And in the airlines, same thing. Whatever fuel they use, it's going to have to be available at all the airports that they go to. So what we may end up with, particularly in ocean shipping, right now ships go wherever they want to go. You may see some of these larger ships just go certain routes because they know that that's where they can get the fuel.
Well, that's interesting because it does pose an interesting logistical issue, because if you've got large ships moving freight point to point, but not to certain destinations because of lack of fueling capability, that does open a window for other types of freight movement to have to actually step in. And so it sort of paints a really difficult logistical problem. How much is policy going to dictate this outcome? What are the potential solutions that policymakers are pontificating at the moment?
Well, let's start with an assumption, and I can say this as somebody who's a former legislator. Usually the people making policy know very little about the industry that their policy is going to affect. And so the issue is going to be, how will the various modes of transportation react? I mean, for example, in the United Kingdom, they've already mandated 10% sustainable aviation fuel. Without any idea, is that even an achievable thing? Is there enough? Can you make enough sustainable aviation fuel to accommodate that? And if every country followed that lead, then where does that leave us? The environmental policies, California saying the trucks have to go electric. Well, for short-haul trucks, that's great, but for long-haul trucks, that doesn't work unless there's a huge improvement in batteries, and the batteries get lighter, because at the same time, people don't want heavy trucks, but batteries automatically make the trucks heavier. So I think policy is going to have a huge impact, and it will be country to country, state to state. Even the continents differ. I mean, things in Europe are going to be handled differently than they are here. That's why this is such a ripe subject for study.
Absolutely. Not to mention refueling. If you talk about battery electric trucking, just because you see infrastructure installed in California doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be installed in Arizona, Nevada, and even farther east. So it presents an interesting set of challenges that policymakers certainly have to be aware of. But really, when it gets down to execution, it's about the investments that are made in the activity itself. And I wonder if you could speak to a little bit some of the investments that different industry organizations within the transportation space are talking about and thinking about at this moment.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, the railroads, they kind of run their own game. So they will make the investment that makes the most sense for them. And probably there won't be much interference in terms of government policy. But then ocean shipping, they're going to be impacted by policies in different countries all over the world. When it comes to trucking, little side note, the interstate highway system, which everybody thought was done initially for military purposes to make sure we could move military goods back and forth, turned out to be one of the absolute best things that ever happened to the U.S. logistics and U.S. supply chain, because we have a much more efficient system than they do almost anywhere else. If you're going to somehow now dictate a change in who operates on that and what fuels they have to use, who's going to pay to put in those different fueling stations? And are you going to put in for electric trucks, which I don't think is feasible, liquid hydrogen, CNG, LNG, all the alternatives? I think not. So somebody sometime is going to make a decision that this is the direction we're going to go. And we hope it's the right decision, because that will determine the efficiency of the entire logistical operation in the United States.
So I know you engage a lot with particularly folks in the freight space. How engaged are they in these discussions with policymakers at the moment?
They're fully engaged and skeptical at the same time, because they recognize and they are fully committed to a better environment. They're not trying to hide the ball or anything in this process, but they want the decision to be the right one. And so in the case of truckers, for example, you don't want the efficiency of the trucks to go down dramatically, because then that hurts everybody, all the way down to the consumer, whether the consumer realizes it or not. Because at the end of the day, whether it moves by ship to get here or even by rail to a major rail depot, those final miles are always going to be by truck.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we came out of COVID, the world got a sort of reminder, a very stark reminder of the importance of supply chains. As a matter of fact, I think those two words were used quite often in the primetime news discussion about failures in supply chains, and it ranged from ports all the way down to movement away from ports. And it was really an interesting time. It was a sort of re-education, if you will, about what drives economic activity. I wonder if you could lean into a little bit as we think about the future of fuels and transitioning different types of fuel use for the various modes of transportation. What are some of the biggest challenges that we face into ensuring that supply chains aren't massively disrupted as we undertake this huge endeavor?
The biggest challenge is always underestimating the problems that come along with a major change. It's fine, for example, I'll keep picking on California, it's fine to say, trucks have all got to go electric, except when you realize that the batteries in that truck are going to use up a lot of the weight, and that weight could be used for freight. And then those same trucks can't be used outside of the state of California. So it somehow becomes much more inefficient. The policy itself, good, bad, or indifferent, it just breeds inefficiency. And so I think the change is what makes it so difficult for the freight industry to get their arms around. I'll give you an example of a policy that's a little bit different, but bear with me. We used to have a totally regulated transportation system. Filed rate doctrine was in place for railroads, for trucks, and then deregulation came along in the 1970s, 1980s. The industry was terrified. What are we going to do? We're used to being able to know exactly how much to charge, and now it's a dog-eat-dog competition. Nobody can argue that deregulation wasn't beneficial to the supply chains. I mean, the U.S. particularly became much more efficient. Well, that's not quite the same as what we're talking about here, but it was the same big change. So whatever change occurs is going to have to settle out quickly. Because if we have 5, 6, 7 different fuels being used by one mode, that's not efficient. And it's the efficiency. That's what moves freight. Because the margin on a freight movement is so slim that just the slightest little tick can throw it off balance. And for the U.S., that could cost a lot of jobs. They could go somewhere else.
That actually leads directly into the next question I was going to ask you, which is really focused on, given the supply chain challenges, given the potential equipment turnover that would have to occur for different modes of transportation, depending on the fuel choices ultimately are either regulated into existence or chosen. What is the most important or the most important set of issues that need to be considered across different modes of transport. So maybe start with freight, but if you could step into a little bit, air transportation and passenger transport.
The most important consideration for all modes is reliability. Whatever fuel is chosen, it has to be reliable. The people operating the equipment have got to know that it's going to be available, it's going to be cost effective, and they're not going to somehow find themselves out on this limb with no place to go. So that's what's going to make all the difference in the world, the reliability of the fuel source, which is why it's so important. I'm kind of a transportation guy, but as you well know, we've got a lot of people around here that are total experts on how much of various rare earth minerals, various fuel alternatives are available. I mean, I mentioned the sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel, and Mark Finley, one of our colleagues here, within an hour sent me an estimate that he'd done on the back of an envelope. That's the kind of study that needs to be done, and that's what not only the policymakers, but the operators need to know before they go down a path for a particular fuel. They need to know how much might really be available, not just in the total sense of availability, but how much can actually get to them on a reliable basis. And that's back to the supply chains. So it's not even the new fuel. And one more example I'll give you. There's a lot of discussion of ammonia right now. Well, I know in at least one circumstance, there's a conversation about an ammonia plant that's going to be built or was going to be built. And ammonia was going to be railed to the port and, would be used for ships. The railroad didn't know for sure if they wanted to haul ammonia because of the safety considerations. Well, those questions need to be answered before you invest a whole lot of money in ammonia-powered ships. It may work. I'm not saying it doesn't, but those are the questions that the modes have to address and the policymakers have to address. And right now, they don't have the answers to those questions, and that's hopefully what we start coming up with here.
Absolutely. I mean, you're pointing to a host of costs that could potentially be burdensome as new supply chains develop and new fuels are ultimately offered to different modes of transport. It begs a really, to me, an interesting question, which is what role does the market ultimately play in determining what choices are made?
Well, the market will be the ultimate decider within the parameters set by government policy. And I think that's what everybody has to understand. The government can say, you can't use this fuel. I don't think they will, but they could. And you have to use this type of fuel. Well, once those decisions are made by government policy, then the market takes over. And who's going to supply that fuel most efficiently, most reliably, and that will determine who wins and loses. That's what's fascinating about this. Make no mistake, there are going to be some real winners and some real losers in this transition. Hopefully, on a modal scale, there will be that. On an individual company scale, there will be that. And probably even on a country scale, there will be that.
Yeah, that's interesting. It certainly makes one ponder quite a bit about the future of transportation, the future of fuels, and what it means ultimately for economies. Because, as I said at the opening, transportation and economic activity are intimately linked. And when we think about the future, ultimately how this question settles out around the future of fuels is going to be critical for determining the economic well-being of the United States and our kids' kids, et cetera. So do you have any other final remarks you'd like to make before we close?
Yeah, I guess one final, since you brought up the economic health, I always use an example. You go to the doctor, they determine your health largely by how well your circulatory system works. Well, an economy, the circulatory system is the transportation system. And if it doesn't work, then the health of the economy goes down. So that's what people need to be worried about. That's why this is such an important topic, because the transportation system runs on fuel. And if we don't get this right going into the future, then it will have that ripple effect throughout the whole economy.
That's a fantastic analogy to end on. Thanks for joining me here today, Ed. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the U.S., and the world. Baker Briefing is produced by Victoria Jupp, Shannon Moriarty, and Karina Zimmel. AV production is led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more.